Hello, my name is Jeffrey Hammond, and I'd like to start by thanking you for attending this session, wherever you may be around the globe. Today, I'd like to speak to you with a slightly different perspective. If you're a DevOps practitioner, I'm sure you occasionally find it challenging trying to get C-level executives to understand the value of the DevOps investments that you want to make, especially compared to investment asks for digital transformation, cloud migration, innovation, new product development, and demands for top-line growth. It's easy for let's improve our DevOps capability to get put on the back burner. Okay, let's get started. I have to say, I love the overarching theme of this year's event, putting the dev in DevOps. It's great. For the past 30 years, I've been all about the dev. I started my career writing code and managing development teams in what was then the Big Six. I spent about a decade helping create development tools, requirements management, software modeling tools, source code management, testing, you name it. Then I spent about 15 years as an industry analyst covering software development trends and technologies, Agile, DevOps, value stream management, and cloud computing. As an analyst, I spoke with hundreds of development leaders and developers every year about their challenges and their triumphs. Now today, if I had to distill all of those conversations and all of those product development efforts down to their essence and answer the question of what putting the dev back in DevOps means to me, it comes down to three things. We should focus on helping developers write more code that matters. As creatives, developers are intrinsically motivated. One of my favorite pieces of research that I wrote was about these intrinsically motivated type I developers. Like other creatives, musicians, actors, or writers, deep down, most developers want to create code with meaning that they can point to and be proud of. Our DevOps investments should enable them. 2, we should help them get fast feedbacks. As creatives, developers seek to confirm whether the code that they've written matters. We seek the opinions of our peers and our customers. When we create things that matter, it validates the creation process and the creator. What developer wants to wait weeks or months for the dopamine jolt of success? 3, we need to maximize time in flow. A few years ago when I was at Forrester, I ran a survey that asked developers how much time in their day they spend doing various tasks, including writing new code. Surprisingly, for most developers, the answer was only around 2 to 3 hours a day. Other surveys back that stat up. I've posted a link to the new stack that found similar results that's a little bit more recent. Now think about that from a creative perspective. If I get 120 to 150 minutes a day to do what I love, which is writing code that matters, how can I make sure that I maximize time and flow? No distractions, no context shifts, no TPS reports, no status messages, just writing code and getting fast feedback on it. That's what I want as a developer. Now, these things are great, but here's the problem with all that. The folks that make investment decisions about where developers and operators are going to spend their time don't really care about any of those things. They have a very different set of goals. For example, your CFO probably wants to focus on annual recurring revenue from customers, the cost of goods sold to deliver your services and your products, your overall margin, and the growth rate of your top-line revenue. Your chief product officer probably wants to focus on annual recurring revenue, differentiation of products, new features, and of course, time to value, how quickly they can get those things out to the customer. Your chief customer officer probably wants to focus on things like customer lifetime value, net revenue retention, net promoter scores. So, as a DevOps practitioner, your first task in getting the DevOps investment that you want is to help your developers, is to connect to what they want, or what they want, to what CXOs want. Sounds simple, right? Well, we can start by connecting the principles we use for our DevOps investments to the things that our CXOs prioritize. I'm going to start here by borrowing from Atlassian, as I like their DevOps principles, and I think their platform team has really written some excellent blogs over the year about how they are actually enabling their own developers to write code that matters, get fast feedback, and increase time and flow. Let's take each principle one by one. ownership. From a developer standpoint, collaboration meshes well with writing code that matters, code that drives business value, customer delight, and ultimately top-line revenue growth. That's if your developers get to see how that code matters. A long time ago, I had a friend that was a director of development at Netflix, and I once asked him, how do you measure your developers? He said, oh, it's simple, by the number of hours of content our customers watch per month. And we have an information radiator right at the door so that they see that stat when they walk in. Think about that from an ownership perspective. When team-based collaboration works, it creates that level of ownership. But when development and operations teams merge into a single team that works across an entire application lifecycle, you can also get an unintended consequence of silos and duplication. Here's a counterexample. At one company I worked for, we once did an audit of how much it was costing us to build our products. Just think about that, just to build our products. We were somewhat shocked to find out that company-wide we had more than 40 release engineers. It was costing us more than $6 million in fully loaded labor costs a year just to build our software. And we built development tools as a business. Obviously, there was a lot of room for standardization, consolidation, and to take labor cost out of the process of building our software. That brings us to automation. Now, when done right, automation provides significant acceleration, for example, with infrastructure as code or automated testing. But again, there's also a potential downside. As teams invest more in automation, the code that drives it can take on a life of its own. In the long run, investments in automation without abstraction can create drag when teams decide that they want to refactor their systems. And that's something that's very much on their minds right now. That is not to say don't do it, but it's important to be aware of the technical debt associated with the automation code that we write. Continuous improvement. When teams implement continuous improvement, it allows developers to get fast feedback, which hopefully validates their code that they're writing that matters. And when it doesn't, then they can pivot and they can make everyone happier while reducing waste. But one of the things that happens when teams push the envelope in iteration is that it can lead to shorter windows of development. And if teams haven't fully minimized their system dependencies, then it can really start to constrain them. At one place I worked, we released new versions of our product suite twice a year. It was a big release train. We had over 30 million lines of code. And when you accounted for all the testing, the integration builds, the packaging that we had to do, all the dependencies that we had to manage, that 6-month delivery window left us in development about 8 weeks of actual development time before we had to start locking down the core components that everything else in our products depended upon. We just didn't have the time to go long, to add big features or disruptive features, unless we wanted to go and implement a parallel development stream. And if you've ever done that, you know that it's got its own complexity and its own issues. Now at Amazon, we're big believers in customer-centric action. Our working backwards process starts by understanding what our customers need. Working backwards from the customer helps us quickly answer questions and helps us get immediate visibility into their needs. It's how we've conceived and built successful services like Amazon Redshift and Amazon Aurora. But even so, sometimes you have to prioritize product innovation. Just ask Henry Ford. 90% of what we build at AWS is what our customers ask for. But that other 10% is also important. We have to worry about a bias toward tactical action. An example of that other 10% is AWS Lambda, which has helped us pioneer the event-driven serverless computing space. Finally, when you create with the end in mind, it helps drive the conversation between CXOs and DevOps teams. In our working backwards process, we begin with a PR FAQ, which literally spells out the customer outcomes we'd like to see before we cut a line of code, including the types of customer quotes we imagine would highlight the business value of what our efforts would realize. But to make this work well, product teams need to have a holistic understanding of the product and the customers that will use it. And these types of developers, operators, SREs, even product managers just don't grow on trees. Even in the best of times, they're hard to find. You'll likely be forced to increase your investments in training and support, also your change management support for cultural change to make this last principle stick. So, Now that we can align our DevOps principles with what our CXOs want, and we're cognizant of the benefits and the anti-patterns that lurk in that alignment, let's talk about lining our technology investments. Here's what we work with our customers to do to help drive their DevOps capabilities. But one thing that we observe is that while almost every company is getting onto the cloud, a much smaller set of companies fully leverage the capabilities of cloud computing when it comes to driving a DevOps strategy. We all know that cloud computing started out as infrastructure for compute and storage that increases the agility and speed of companies that adopt it by lowering costs and providing elastic capacity with pay-as-you-go pricing. But in my opinion, that's an increasingly backward-looking view of cloud computing that really doesn't fully leverage where cloud computing is evolving. If you look at AWS for today, for example, we have more than 200 fully featured services, including compute and storage for sure, but also mobile, analytics, low-code, database, and yes, DevOps services. An increasing number of these services are managed services, and that's where the emerging opportunity lies for DevOps technology alignment. And of course, we're not alone. This trend toward higher level managed, even serverless services is an industry-wide one that you should factor into your DevOps investments. Why? Because as cloud computing evolves, it changes the way that developers write code. So even as we put developers back into DevOps, we need them to work a little bit differently. We can start to do that by adjusting our focus as DevOps practitioners and looking at 3 questions. First of all, we need to focus on operational excellence. We know that developers like to write code. It's what they want to do. But we need to be more diligent in asking this question. Is the code that our developers are writing code that matters? And does it matter to your CXOs? Is it code that differentiates, that drives growth, that speeds up feature releases, that increases customer lifetime value? Question number 2. As cloud computing evolves, expect that new services, new managed services, new serverless services will continue to increase the level of abstraction and move the bar of what's a commodity higher. Someone in your organization needs to ask the question of how these new services could be leveraged to reduce time to market. Number 3, we tend to give technical debt short shrift at best because it's really hard to measure, and fixing it isn't nearly as gratifying as building new features or driving top-line growth. Your CXOs are probably dimly aware of its existence. But part of building a lasting, modern DevOps strategy is an ongoing focus on the things that drag us down and allow competitors to get a jump on us as the commodity bar goes ever upward. So ask if your technical debt is slowing your innovation. Now, at Amazon, we've been working with some of our customers to help them align their DevOps investments with the needs of CPOs, CFOs, and chief customer officers by helping them fully leverage the evolving cloud. To do this, our team has developed a simplified framework that we use to drive the conversations, and I think it can also work for you. Now, I have to give full credit to our team leader, Charles Chu, for this. You can read more about it in the link that I've provided here. And I want to be clear, there is absolutely nothing here that is unique to AWS or our services. You can use this framework no matter where you are on your cloud journey and who you're taking it with. Here's how it works. First of all, mass represents the total resources, budget, and people devoted to developing your product capabilities. Now, in an ideal world, the ratio of mass applied to differentiated, revenue-generating activities is high. But all too often, that's not the case. I was recently commiserating with a CPO who observed how hard it was for him to pierce what he called the veil of engineering and understand what so many of the team's developers were actually working on and how it related to the company's priorities for growth and innovation. That's not good from the perspective of this equation. If it sounds like something you're familiar with, then you need to think about how you can use this to improve that ratio. Now, secondly, acceleration represents an organization's development processes and their operational environment. Investments here should help teams apply resources faster. That is where we traditionally tend to live as DevOps practitioners, and investment in the principles of automation and continuous improvement are good examples of how we can apply effort to the acceleration part of this equation to get a better outcome. Now, together, the resources we invest and the rate at which we are able to invest them result in the amount of force, the market impact that our company can generate in terms of the measures that matter to the CXOs: top-line growth, product differentiation, customer satisfaction. When we improve the ratio of mass that's deployed to these things, and we increase the rate at which we can release those, we get greater force. So that's how we move forward. Now, since acceleration is where we often start within our existing DevOps strategies, I want to start by diving a little bit deeper into acceleration and return to that question about whether our developers are writing the right things, i.e. code that differentiates our business and drives innovation and growth. If the answer is yes, then by all means, let's focus primarily on accelerating what they are writing. If it's something that you're not that sure about, then we need to move on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if they are writing code that matters, then there are many levers that we can examine to drive further acceleration into the cloud, and that these levers can be a source of a DevOps investment strategy. So some of the ones that come up in our conversations on a regular basis with our customers, obviously automation, being able to deploy what you are writing programmatically. Managed services, for example, a managed database management service or an event processing service that can reduce the amount of effort required to maintain the service that your developers are using. Experimentation, the ability to run a test, to flag a feature, to turn it on or off, to get that fast feedback, and then be able to take that feedback and use it to evolve the product further is really important. Interestingly enough, low-code tools end up being a way to accelerate the delivery of code that matters. Standardized deployment pipelines, getting away from that $6 million in labor spent just on building your product. Patterns and templates, Helm charts, operators would be a good example of these sorts of things. And then finally, frameworks. Of course, one of our favorites at AWS is the well-architected framework that help teams accelerate and do better. But while we're all about the acceleration from a DevOps perspective, that's not the only thing that we need to think about. We also need to be honest about the sources of drag that can potentially result in the lines of code that a developer writes actually slowing down the ability to release new capability. What are some of those items of drag? So if I've written code, I've created technical debt. That's the reality. It happens really easily. I was talking with a company just a couple weeks ago, very small organization. They've only been around for a couple years, but that minimum lovable product that they've written already is creating technical debt that constrains them. And they're looking at what they have to do to refactor that product and add new capabilities. Manual processes. If we've written code and we don't have fully automated processes, then we've got to be able to run those manual processes, and we're constrained by the speed at which we can run them. Verification and validation. We want to make sure that the code's working right, and if we've written it, we've got to test it. We've got to make sure that it scales. Dependencies is actually a gotcha that you often see. Going back to that constrained release time, if you had have a lot of dependencies on the code that you've written, then by necessity, you've got to make sure that those dependencies are upheld and supported. Governance and risk and compliance are also both areas. So for every 1, 10, 100,000 lines of code that you write, you want to make sure that if you're incurring these potential sources of drag, that code really matters and it really provides value. Now let's go back to the mass part of the equation. I think one of the new roles that DevOps practitioners have as the cloud evolves is to ask questions about where developer and operator resources are applied with a sharp eye toward what is innovation and what is commodity. The follow-up should be a focus on reducing the mass of resources that we apply to the commodity, subject to the constraints of mitigation cost and risk. Here's an example that comes up a lot in our customer conversations. For many digital native businesses, launching their first minimum lovable product is a top priority, and it should be. But what happens when that MLP succeeds and it starts to scale and it runs across multiple EC2 instances or multiple virtual machines running RDBMSs, and you have to do that on a global basis across multiple regions? as all of those things begin to happen, the ratio of resources required to maintain and extend that minimum lovable product start to increase dramatically. Here's where teams that leverage the cloud start to transform themselves. It might start by replacing a database tier with a managed DBMS service. That frees up resources to apply to other areas like refactoring the front end, which unlocks the ability to do experimentation when the front end has been componentized, which sets the stage for personalization, which increases the ratio of differentiating features that are delivered based on individual types of users. Starting small can yield big results. Fundamentally, what a DevOps professional practitioner needs to do is ask the question across the various levels of our architecture, what things are differentiated and what things are commodity, and how is that changing over time? I've put some examples here. It's not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. And by articulating the things that are commodity and looking to turn those into managed services, or even outsourcing the creation of those into something like an AWS service, you free up time to focus on the above the waterline things. By the way, this is also one of the biggest advantages that a centralized platform team can provide. By making these assessments at an ongoing, standardized level of effort and centralizing the refactoring costs and risks, you can create a force multiplier that enables multiple developers to go faster, to focus on writing the code that matters instead of integrating with a database 1,000 different ways. Now, when we've worked with customers using this sort of framework and really getting them to understand where their opportunities for differentiation lie, we've seen some really pretty amazing results. I've already mentioned Atlassian and Micros, but here's some more. And I've put links to detailed descriptions of what these folks did and the benefits that they've achieved. But I can't help but resist in cherry picking a few quotes. Lacework is a good example. What they did was they moved from a self-managed Kubernetes control plane to a fully managed control plane. Didn't want to be managing their own Kubernetes environment. And I love the quote. As a result of our migration, our engineers can now prioritize innovation. Before, we were spending just too much time maintaining that Kubernetes cluster. If you're investing in containers and Kubernetes, that's probably something that resonates pretty strongly. Let me give you another example from Janssen. In their case, they unified the way that their DevOps team or their data science team works, MLOps as opposed to DevOps. And in their case, they increased the speed of feature engineering by approximately 700%, helping them reduce costs and increased their efficiency. So I want to thank you for your time today. I'll close by reinforcing a few of these thoughts. First of all, identify your customers and work backward from them. But this is potentially a trick question. The emphasis is on that S. Are your customers the developers? Well, maybe. We are putting them back at the center of DevOps, right? But here's the reality. Those developers aren't funding your investments. It's the CXOs, the CPO, the CFO, the CCO that are. So even if the developer is the main beneficiary and you're prioritizing their needs, make sure that you listen to your CXOs and that you align what you want to do to the things that matter to them. If you spend some time making sure that you understand what's driving them and work backward from that, you'll get the sort of investments that you need to be successful. Secondly, automation is great. You should pursue it, but don't forget the value that continuous improvement provides. Don't forget the small steps that you can take to free up an operator here, an SRE there, a developer on this project, and how those resources can be turned back into above the waterline features and capabilities that differentiate the business. Every time you can make one of those things happen, you're going to make your CPO a happy camper. Adjust your DevOps tactics in step with where the cloud is going, not just where the cloud is today. There are lots of services beyond storage and beyond compute that can significantly reduce the amount of code that your developers have to write, the amount of images that your operators have to maintain. Especially if that work is commodity level work, you're essentially burning money and you're setting yourself up to be competed against by another organization that is willing to move up the stack and take full advantage of leveraging what the cloud offers today. Finally, Use the simple formula, Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, to drive your ongoing engagement with your CXOs. Ask them the following questions. What are our acceleration investments? How are we reducing drag in our organization? Are we really writing code that differentiates? Really? Does it really do that? Where can we use managed cloud services to free up resources and put them back into writing the code that does matter? And finally, are we doing enough to attack the technical debt that is a drag on our innovation? If you do these things, I guarantee you will better align with what your CXOs want. You'll be able to fully leverage the cloud resources that are out there for anyone to take advantage of, to increase their speed, to increase the amount of differentiated work, and your CXOs will thank you for it.